Welcome back to our open source startup podcast. As usual, we're super excited. This is Tim from SNVC, our lovely partner from Cowboy Ventures, Robbie. And I think before we jump into our normal show, we're super thankful to have 20,000 listeners. And it's been growing at a really, really healthy rate, and really love all your support and all your feedback. So Robbie and I are super grateful to have all of you on our show and listen. So anything you'd like us to change or any love you have for us, please share it. We super appreciate that. That said, we're super excited to have Snowplow Analytics to be on our podcast. Alex is a founder, and Snowplow is the behavioral data platform. So welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me, guys, and congratulations on 20,000. That's an awesome milestone. That's really, really well done.
We're super excited to be celebrating with you today on the podcast. And as per usual, we love to start at the very beginning. And so I think this is going back to 2012 when Snowplow was originally created. So let's go back to 2012 and give us kind of the founding story, where the idea for Snowplow came from.
Sure thing. So Snowplow's been around a while. Yali, who's my co-founder, and we started the project back 10 years ago in 2012. And we'd been consulting together for a few years in London, doing a variety of different projects. But we'd been really hungry to sort of build our own company, and we loved open source. We'd met at an open source startup back in 2007. So we were looking at kind of challenges our clients had. Our clients were kind of brands in the UK. And we noticed that we were doing a lot of kind of customer 360, customer analytics projects for them. And they were able to give us really granular transactional data, but they couldn't really give us any what we now call behavioral data, and back then called clickstream data. So they were using things like Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics, which were fine, but we wanted like the fire hose of every single page view, every single button click. And we basically just wanted all that in AWS S3 bucket so that we could do any analysis we wanted, put Python on top, put R on top, write SQL. And so we came up with a sort of a very rough and ready, raw but powerful pipeline that would collect that data, generate that data inside the web browser using JavaScript tracker, and then route it through into AWS, do some work on it, and store it in S3. And we called it Snowplow, and we open sourced it in 2012, and that's how we started. And so for the first kind of 3 years, we were working on kind of, project community fit, so the open source version of product market fit, evolving that kind of closer to what the kind of emerging data teams needed, and then kind of winding down our consultancy as we went and spinning up Snowplow as its own company. So that's kind of how we got started.
Yeah, this path from consulting to a data startup has been probably one of the most favorite paths, besides going to a mountain or some kind of resort or something like that. That's those two very distinct paths that has very successful data startups. And so love to talk into more about the journey, because when you started an open source project, obviously, I don't know if that's really the intention to start a company just solely on that project, but it definitely has grew, and instead you changed to shut down consultancy to start this instead. What did you see? Right? What did you saw? Is it in the growth? Is it the momentum that led you to that path?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Yali and I were quite intentional about creating it as a company. We open sourced the project into a new corporate entity. But you're right, and in those early days, you don't know how much it's going to take off. Sort of don't give up the day job, so to speak, back then. But we saw two really interesting signs quite early on. So the first sign in 2012 was that we started getting these sort of data mavericks or data MacGyvers inside some interesting big corporations like Vodafone and Bauer and News Corp. We started to see them sort of getting into the project and realizing that it was kind of a way of kind of getting that rich behavioral data and without having to hire, having big data engineering teams like people were building on the West Coast. So that was a really encouraging sign. And then the second was really that we started retooling Snowplow for columnar data warehouses in, I think, late 2012, early 2013. And we were able to kind of add support for Redshift, I think within like a couple of weeks of Redshift going into public beta. And so we saw a real kind of hockey stick off that, because people were going online searching for sort of web analytics into Redshift, because obviously, your web, your customer behavioral data was a really interesting big data set to get into these new, cheaper cloud DWs. And so we saw some really great adoption of that. And so you put those two things together, and you know, by 2013 into 2014, we were really seeing like, you know, this had legs, and we were early to the market. Like data teams didn't really exist as a thing fully back then. The modern data stack certainly wasn't kind of prime time, but yeah, we saw a lot of signs that we could focus on this full time.
So I'd love to dig into these signs in particular, because I think, especially in today's world where open source is just such a common path for technical tools, there's a lot of hype around it, around launching an open source project and then feeling like within a year you can have a commercial version. It's just like this very fast turnaround. But I think one of the things we've been learning on the podcast is how long it takes for a lot of these open source projects to become the de facto standard. So how long did it take? And what were some of those early signs that this was really becoming adopted by data teams?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that I'll answer the question in a sec, but to your earlier point, like I think people are trying to sort of bake the cake really quickly now, and you know, sort of almost going through from concept to project on GitHub to some stars to really accelerating through, and you know, at the risk of kind of, you know, subtweeting someone, like, you know, I've seen startups recently that are like jumping straight to like billboards in football stadiums and things like that. And like, I don't know that you kind of got to let this stuff gestate. And a lot of the power of open source is that ability to sort of distribute it really widely and let people adopt it and riff off it and give you feedback on how it needs to evolve. So to answer your question about Snowplow, so I guess those two signs were really powerful. We started to see different kind of companies in different industries starting to sort of bring Snowplow into production. I think that's kind of an important point. Like, it's one thing to have a kind of a early adopter visionary inside a big company, you know, sort of get excited about it, but they often sort of move on to the next exciting thing, and you know, they're deeply curious people, which is awesome. But we started to see companies kind of put it into production. So it's exciting because you start to see this adoption in these larger organizations, and you get put into production. And we had like really great meetups going in different cities, and then the, you know, people from those companies would go and speak at those meetups and explain, you know, how central Snowplow had become to their architecture. So we just saw a lot of encouraging signs.
And I think definitely, I feel like the time has changed so much of how to even launch open source projects, where people now have more tools, more platforms, more things to track, a bunch of things. There are more, you know, podcasts like us to even talk about it. I think 2012, there wasn't that much sort of channels to really go and publish. And so what was your strategy back then to grow this project? Like, what did you do? And what did you learn even in those early days? Because I saw early releases, there isn't that much discussing about the Snowplow, I guess, the platform or the vision. There's a lot more like point releases of connectors, and connectors seems to be more very specific about visualization and some very more specific use cases, right? So we talk a little bit like how the message and things change over time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So a lot of our, there's a real grind in the first few years where you've just got to get the features out there that people are asking for, and you know, you build confidence in your early adopters that you're going to be here for a long time and that you're going to solve their problems by just being very responsive and just really getting those features out the door. Another thing we did early, which worked really well for us, was kind of city by city meetups. And by doing that, we kind of, and it's, you know, we started Snowplow in London. London's always had a really good sort of tech meetup scene. But by doing that, we learned something really interesting, which is that people kind of adopt open source and new technology in quite small circles of trust that are quite city specific. And so, you know, we've been reactivating the meetups post-COVID, and you know, our Berlin meetup group has like 1,000 people in it, which is amazing to me. And those meetup groups are really good because you kind of build those social bonds. People kind of, you know, validate the choice of the technology. So meetups have been great. I think another thing that's really kind of underrated with open source and getting the kind of the flywheel going is around the kind of content and thought leadership. So I think you're right. Like, a lot of the early posts were very much, we've done this release, we've added these features. But alongside that, we're also doing quite big provocative pieces around why, you know, you need your own behavioral data in your own warehouse, and other approaches aren't going to work out for you long term and things like that. And so I think having, not every open source company can do it. Like some open source companies are more like the kind of the open source generic commodity play on an established category, which is totally fine. And there's a huge place for that. But I think if your open source project is doing something novel, or you're trying to create a category, or you're trying to disrupt an existing category with something that's sort of, different, not better, or it's a 10x improvement, you've got to blog about that. You've got to get to the events. You've got to sort of find the audience and be quite provocative about it.
So when you started Snowplow, it was around the same time when Segment also started. And if I'm not mistaken, Segment started open source, then decided to go closed source, and then later on. Open source was important to Snowplow.
Yeah, so we to kind of break that into two answers. So on the second piece, we never thought about going proprietary or closed source. So when we started Snowplow in 2012, we knew there were a bunch of companies that were already doing this. So we knew that there were kind of big data teams in FANG and in unicorn startups that were building behavioral data pipelines internally, homebrewing them. And we knew that these kinds of architectures were widely used in like SaaS analytics and in like ad tech and martech and things like that. So the kind of the genesis, the original disruption of Snowplow was get that in the hands of everybody else. Let every other brand, generate their own rich behavioral data rather than having to sort of buy it from third parties. So it was never a thought to go open to close off the source. And happy to talk about how we started monetizing in 2015 in a moment. On Segment specifically, I think Segment is for us. So we obviously saw Segment emerging. We'd been doing a lot of kind of seeding of Snowplow using Hacker News. They were obviously in YC, so we saw them coming up there. I think to be honest, we in data, people often get confused about their personas. And I think we didn't realize early on that Segment was going after quite a different persona from us. So we were kind of we'd come from this analytics, BI background, dabbled in data science, and we were building for these kind of emerging data teams. And I think in hindsight, Segment had come out of this kind of, fast growth startup, growth teams, kind of product engineering, tag management for developers thing. And it's funny because you can have quite similar technologies or philosophies, but if you have a different persona in mind, you end up in really different places. So, sometimes when people ask me today, kind of what's different about Snowplow versus the Segment technology, I'm like, it's almost like there was a tech tree fork back in 2012, 2013, and a bunch of vendors that went off this way, and we went off in this different way and kind of focused on different things.
What I'm talking about, because I think the community parts of it definitely is very interesting. But more interesting is probably your story. Your products actually has been morphing. And comparing to your blog post back in 2012, and now comparing it to your Series B announcement blog post, right? It's almost like it's a very different company. You definitely mentioned now it's Act 2, right? I actually saw that word you use, Act 2 of our company now. So maybe talk about what's Act 1. Because from Act 1, I saw 2012, what you're hinted is your product is the easiest way to get data into your own warehouse, I guess Hive and Mahout was mentioned, right? You have your own ML frameworks, you have your own teams and your own ways you want to dissect it. You have more granular ways to do single customer views. That was sort of what I saw is the biggest selling point, right? Now we've all the way here. So maybe talk about the journey. What has you learned as you started? And did you plan Act 2 all the way from the beginning? What's the biggest thing you learned during that journey?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think so. It's funny. It's kind of funny to categorize 10 whole years as Act 1 in a startup. Because 10 years is a lot of startups don't last 10 years. And so, our first act is 10 years. And, we really, we're very excited about the next 10 years and we want Snowplow to be around much, much longer than that. I guess Act 1, we didn't stand still. So a lot evolved over those 10 years. So we started commercializing in 2015. and started building a team around that. We were bootstrapped up till 2019 through 2022. We did 3 rounds culminating in the NEA Series B, and grew the team up substantially. So there was a lot of change in that Act One, but I guess the common themes through that act were we were very focused on open source and one specific delivery model. So what we started offering in 2015 was kind of a managed service model where we would run Snowplow for companies in their own account. And that evolved over the last 7 years into what we call private SaaS. So essentially it's software as a service. The control plane is centrally hosted, but the data plane still lives inside customer's own account. And that's a really kind of, it's quite an exciting model. And I think it's going to be a really big trend in open source going forwards. But that's been our only distribution model. We didn't really go into support contracts. We didn't go into hosted or anything like that. So yeah, I think Act Two, there's a really exciting piece around what other ways do we get Snowplow into organizations' hands? What other distribution models? And we're doing some work on that at the moment and hoping to have announcements on that quite soon. I think another really interesting piece is for the first 10 years of Snowplow, we were very focused on kind of web and mobile data. So we help organizations create really rich web and mobile data. And we have a bunch of server-side trackers as well, but it's predominantly this kind of consumer, customer, user data. That's really, really important. But what I think a lot of people don't always realize about Snowplow is that the underlying technology we have is very powerful for data mesh. It's very good for sort of data contracts and some of these emerging questions around how do you get data producers and data consumers kind of working with each other. And so for the next 10 years of Snowplow, for Act Two, we're very interested in kind of extending our kind of data contracts capability and extending what types of enterprise data you can create with Snowplow. So yeah, I think with open source, I think you've kind of constantly got to be. It's not right to say reinventing yourself, because that implies you're sort of constantly pivoting, and that's not going to work. But you need to have this really strong kind of technology vision. The product needs to keep moving forwards, and you need to kind of be mindful of what's happening in the market and what problems you can solve. Because I think that's the way you stay relevant, and we've done that a lot over 10 years, and yeah, we've got lots to do for the next 10 years.
It's quite remarkable just how so many companies will kind of start in the Act Two venture growth kind of stage, but you, I'm sure, have just so many learnings of just going from the bootstrapped route first and really like narrowing in on your persona and their needs and the community first. What advice, I guess, based on that journey versus so many other kind of like really quick startup journeys where they're kind of like venture growth in the very beginning when their open source project launches, going the path that you did, like what would you say are kind of the biggest benefits to that? And also like advice to companies that are maybe taking a different route on just things to consider, given that you kind of got to know your community a lot longer in a sense than a lot of others do before you try to really get a lot out of them from a monetization perspective.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think getting to know the community, building those relationships is a really valuable thing, and it's not something you can do super quickly. So I think that's a valuable thing. I think another thing is it's really hard to time tech trends and market trends. And so I think one of the challenges of trying to sort of jump straight to Act Two is the timing may not necessarily be right. So you could have the right product, you could have a really good instinct for where the market's going to go. You think a certain technology is going to completely revolutionize things. DuckDB is a great example. I met with the DuckDB guys in Amsterdam last week. Phenomenal technology. If you're building something around DuckDB, like it's a great long-term bet, but like, what's the right timing on that? Like, how quickly is something like DuckDB going to go super mainstream? So I think the timing piece is really interesting. I think I'd almost go back to the first point, like getting to know your personas, I think is really valuable. And I think getting a sense of how many people are out there or how many organizations are out there that could have a need for what you're working on and how's that going to change over time. I think there's something about just being in a market longitudinally longer that just helps you on that stuff. But equally, you could go the other way. Like, once it's ready, once the market's there, you should crack on and take that opportunity.
And I think the ability to really able to run this whole most analytic alternative or much more granular insights for customers in your on-prem or your own private SaaS, I don't think that's the norm, right? I don't think this is actually, you've seen a lot of examples. I'm sure let's just follow that company because that did well. There wasn't that much people you can follow. So what gave you a reason, temptation of going to this hosted cloud version? Because I'm sure people might even push you for that. Like, hey, go for this route. That's how it's been the most easiest way. Everybody else is going to accept that moving forward. What gave you the conviction this is much more better route to go?
Yeah, I think it's almost become the norm now with new open source projects that it's like you've got to get to the cloud offering really, really fast. And I don't think that's a bad strategy. I don't think there's any problem with that. And I think cloud is hosted offerings, self-service offerings, a really good way of getting more kind of quick initial adoption of your project. It's really low friction. And I'm very aware that self-service hosted products are kind of lower friction than a lot of open source projects. I think for us specifically, going back to 2015, so we had different people asking us for different commercial offerings. We had people asking us for support contracts. We had people asking us for hosted versions of Snowplow. And then we had people asking us for this kind of managed service almost. And I think for us, the managed service was really interesting because it felt closer to the kind of brand promise of Snowplow. So it felt closer to this idea of ownership of your data. We'd created the open source project so brands could own their data. Running the software for them in their own account felt closer to that ethos. But that wouldn't be the case for every open source project. Like it's just kind of how it was for customer behavioral data. And I guess we were sort of on the right side of that trend in that the last few years have all been around, data sovereignty, the rights of the data subject, ownership of that data by the consumer and maybe by the brand, but definitely not by a third party. So yeah, I think it was a good early bet, but we were having a lot of people asking us for it.
Awesome. And we'd love to maybe spend a few minutes talking about what's open source versus what's not, and maybe where you started and some of your frameworks or thinking around it. Because I think in today's environment, there's a lot of kind of push towards having full pieces of the product that are not open source to maybe have some proprietary. But what's your kind of framing on what should and what shouldn't be open source?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the business. For us, we went a very specific route that wouldn't be right for every commercial open source company. So we put the kind of full fat, very powerful version. It was, very rough around the edges, but it was powerful. We put that out there in 2015 and put an Apache 2 license on it. And this is kind of also before the whole kind of open source companies conflicting with the public cloud. So this was sort of a little bit before all that happened. And so for us, it was always we've always been building a very powerful project out in the open. But what we started building in 2015, the commercial offering, which is now called kind of BDP or BDP Enterprise, was a lot of tooling and a lot of IP to make that much more resilient, much more robust, much more scalable for an organization that wants to put workloads into production. So initially we did a lot around scaling, monitoring, auto upgrading, all that kind of stuff. So kind of below the waterline, more like DevOps style things. And then about 3 years ago, we started on the kind of above the waterline. So we built a UI, we built an API. All of that is to help people create more data into Snowplow and then work with the data on the other end. So I guess Snowplow is unusual in that we kind of put a very powerful version of the platform out there when a lot of people just put Pocket or community editions out there. But on the flip side, we never ship to UI open source, whereas a lot of open source projects will do that just to get people started. So the Snowplow open source feels more like a bunch of powerful Lego bricks, and then the commercial offering kind of brings those together with a bunch of IP around it to deliver kind of enterprise grade product.
So I'm looking at your So is the open source project a lot more mature, or there's a little change of strategy back in 2020? Yeah, just was curious based on that graph. It's a little bit hard to tell what has happened.
Yeah, it's so essentially what happened was, and we learned lessons from it, is we moved from almost a kind of a mono repo approach that we used for the first 8 years to much more of a sort of a microservices approach, kind of those Lego bricks. And it was interesting. It was cleaner from a kind of an engineering perspective, but it was harder from a community perspective, and it was harder to almost communicate what we were working on and all that kind of stuff back to the community. So we're starting to sort of bring everything back into one house again, but that's more to track things because the architecture is still much more like microservice based. So it's kind of an interesting story. Like, we have a huge number of engineers working on open source. It's all public on our the org.com page. And so, we've always had like 70-80% of our engineers working on open source, the core kind of behavioral data transit layer. And that continues as we scale up. So it was never a kind of a redirection of team or anything. But you do realize as you kind of work through these things that the optics of a project, for example, on GitHub, they really matter to people. So like people will look at like how many stars you're getting or this or that. And yeah, like who's anyone to say that's a vanity metric or whatever? Like if people are using that to sort of understand how popular a project is, then we've kind of got to listen.
So it looks like, just taking like dates off of your LinkedIn, that when Act 2, right before that really started for the company, that was when you transitioned to the CEO role. And so would love to talk a bit about what that transition was like and like why it happened and whether it was truly part of this kind of Act 2 vision for what the product was going to be.
Yeah. So I stepped into the CEO role in May 2018. And so that was just before we started working on our first fundraise. And so that was kind of the inflection point between the sort of the bootstrap period and us wanting to sort of step on the gas, bring in external capital funding and sort of scale the business up. And I think there were a couple of interesting reasons to come out of the bootstrap phase and move into a funding phase then. And I think this is probably really relevant for a lot of like open source founders as they think through these things. So we'd seen that the data market, this modern data market, the timing was then right. Like we'd seen, we'd grown up with startups like Looker and Snowflake, and suddenly they were kind of, off to the races and had really high brand recognition. And Snowplow was in an interesting, different place where we had great technology, we had a very loyal community and customer base, but we weren't that widely known. And I was going to conferences and sitting through talks where people were sort of talking about having built the same kinds of architectures themselves on top of like AWS services, but not using Snowplow. And I remember going up to someone who'd given a talk like that in early 2018, and I was like, out of interest, why didn't you use Snowplow? Like it would have saved you, so many person years of engineering. And they were just like, what's Snowplow? So I was like, okay. So you can build all this tech, but if you don't have the recognition, it's kind of, it's not going to have the same impact. So that was a really interesting trend. And then the other trend that Yali and I had seen was realizing that developing open source is actually quite capital intensive. So we'd done a replatform with AWS from the batch data services to the real-time ones. We'd added in support for Google Cloud, and replatformings and adding extra platforms, they just take quite a lot of capital. So we kind of realized by kind of 2018, Yali kind of realized it first, then I realized it, that we needed to raise capital and kind of accelerate the business. And I took on the CEO role as part of that.
So there's raising capital as part of raising a company's profile, but then there's all the marketing that goes into it. And so I'm curious because I think one trend that we see with a lot of technical founders is this underinvestment in go-to-market. Customer-facing persona.
I think it's been a huge team effort. So when we went into the fundraising, when we went into 2019, we had a super technical team. Almost everyone in the company had a job title that ended in engineer. As we raised money, we were able to kind of build out the missing half of the company, and a lot of that was around marketing, was around sales and related functions. So we had founder-led selling for the first 6 years, and we hired our first AE, Charlie, and then kind of grew from there. So it was a real kind of portfolio effort. I think you're right. I think a lot of open source projects have a real challenge with marketing and with sales. And I think the marketing, the problem is you don't develop those muscles very, very well, because there's always an escape hatch, which is, if I can't explain the project to you, just download it, poke it with a stick, and figure out if it does what you need it to. So, with open source is far more than just a price point of 0. But if you have a price point of 0, anyone can do a free taste test and figure out if this software is for you. And so I think open source software companies don't get good earlier at explaining the value proposition, explaining the offer, explaining the kind of the value exchange going on. So it took us a lot of time to do that. I think starting to build out product marketing was really, really important for us. And then on the sales side, I think that working hard to kind of get clear on the personas was really important for us as well. So we had a bit of a breakthrough. I think it was 2019 or 2020 when we started thinking about data maturity and realizing that a lot of companies, including most digital natives, go through these kind of different stages of data maturity, and that if we talk to them kind of too early, it's great to meet them, but they're probably better off just getting started slowly and getting their first kind of Postgres in place and things like that. And conversely, when we talk to the really late kind of unicorns, back then they'd often built a lot of homebrew pipelines themselves, and now we're kind of successfully getting those replaced with Snowplow. But back then it was a harder ask. So I think really understanding the personas was really key to us.
And I think fast forward to maybe even now, where I think a lot of people, when we hear about open source projects or companies has been running for a while, open source seems to actually have less impact of how customers make decisions of what products or project to choose. And I noticed in your at least getting started guide, right? There's 4 paths, right? Trying out the hosted, or just use it on your download open source, right? And there's basically a matrix of choices and different options there. Does open source still matter a lot now? Or does it matter less than before? And I guess what is the sort of the view now after 10 years, and now you have a lot of predominantly, I would assume, comes from the hosted. What does the open source still brings to you?
I think that is gonna be probably the biggest debate in this industry for the next couple of years. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like when you've got these PLG and self-service and sort of hosted trial experiences, what are people getting from open source? And we've spent a lot of time thinking and debating that internally. And the open source ethos in Snowplow is super, super deep. So, but we want to understand it. So I think there's a few things. So I think that the ability, the lack of lock-in with open source is so important. So the idea that like, yes, you're adopting a standard, but it's an open standard, and there's this escape hatch, which is you can go to the underlying Lego bricks. You know, it's true of us, it's true of Databricks. Like I think it's a really compelling thing. And so I think that's not going to go away. And so that's maybe almost like open source as a potential like end state rather than a starting point. As a starting point, I think there's still something really interesting about open source as like, you know, a CLI or like a daemon running on your own laptop. You're on a plane, you're just noodling on this thing. Like you didn't have to, you know, it's so low permission. You didn't have to like put a credit card in, you didn't have to talk to your boss about it. Like, and I think that's a really powerful thing. And I think one other thing about open source kind of related is there's nothing more tangible than something that's just sitting on your laptop that you can poke with a stick. Like, you know, you don't have to like go through API documentation, like, you know, OAuth, all that kind of stuff. Like, it's just so tangible. It's like, it's just like a piece of clay that you've got and you can like mold. So I don't know. Those are probably almost more emotional answers than like econometric ones or anything like that. But I do think there's something very special about open source.
The open source part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think so. It's easy to fall into that trap of viewing your own open sources as competition. You know, you have a new salesperson, like that they lose a deal in their mind to open source, and that. But that concept's super toxic. Like you have to think of, you know, everyone who's adopting your technology, your market standard as part of your community. And, you know, maybe the paid for products aren't right for them. Maybe they will be later. Like, so I think it's really common. I think it's just something to be really careful about. What was some of the costs or cons for us of open source? I think one thing that was kind of interesting over the years was, we had a very permissive license. It's been great for like getting Snowplow into, you know, really, really big, great enterprises. I think we've not always had great visibility of like who's using Snowplow and to what end. And so, you know, to give you a very specific example, like a few years ago, there was this sort of DMP, data management platform trend before the CDP trend. And, you know, multiple DMPs were built on top of Snowplow. But they never really talked to us. And that would have been just so interesting to find out what they were building, how they were commercializing. But they kind of didn't need to talk to us to talk about their use case. And so I think that is, that's a shame, because like Snowplow is really powerful to put inside another product, but those organizations don't always come to us and share. Other than that, not much. I think that, you know, we never went down the support contract route very much. I know other companies do. And yeah, our commercial models worked out well for us. So yeah, I'm a huge open source and commercial open source software company fan. I think it's just great.
And I don't think we really have much chance to talk to founders that run this company for 10 years or more. I think we got Armand from HashiCorp last time. He was around that time. But most others like really early in their journey. I was early, even like 1 to 5, 7. Now you're at the 10-year mark. I wonder, do you have any specific reflection on that 10 years? Like, what will be the hardest part of doing this? And we can also end with like maybe the advice you give other youngsters starting after
other youngsters. I'm not
zero.
Yeah,
youngsters may not be age, but youngsters on the company journey, basically like 0 to 1, right? There's a bunch of those. Reflection.
Yeah. I think okay. So briefly on the first one, I think moving from bootstrap to VC funded was interesting. So I think you know, like when you build a bootstrap business, you're building something quite sort of steady, and it's got cash flow, and it's slightly profitable, and it's you feel good about it. But then in the venture capital world, they're looking for much rapid growth and kind of willingness to deploy capital really quite aggressively to get those outsized outcomes. So communicating that Yali and I were ready for that was a serious thing that we did. Advice for open source founders. I think I'd go back to that point from earlier, which is it's not even don't raise too much money. It's like set up the project and the company in a way that you can kind of go slow until you're ready to go fast. And that's not my language. I know that Sutter Hill have been using that methodology and used it with Snowflake years ago. But I think open source takes time to gestate. The market might not be ready. You might not be ready. And so, take that time and design things in intentionally. Like, think about what license you want to use. Think about the value gradient between, your open source project and your commercial SKUs, your commercial offerings. Think about those. Think about whether you want to do a hosted distribution model. Think about whether you want to go like AWS marketplace. Like, think about all those things, kind of deliberately early on. And don't sort of rush it. There's plenty of time to go fast later.
Awesome. I think that's really great advice to end on. Thank you so much for doing this with us, Alex. This was well worth the wait. And I think our community will really enjoy this conversation.
Thank you, guys. And big congratulations on the 20,000 listeners.